Hi, everybody. I am sitting here. I have the great privilege of sitting here with Dr. Richard Howe from Southern Evangelical Seminary.
Sorry.
And he has graciously agreed to sit down just for a couple of minutes to
Well,
talk.
the $100 bill you promised me, that's,
You
that
were
was
supposed
part
to
of it.
keep that
That was-
between
That
us,
was part of the
okay?
incentive here.
All right. Well, so now you know. But anyways, the man does not come cheap. But that, you know what? $100 is cheap in New York.
Well, maybe so. That's right.
But, you know, a lot of people, when it comes to theology, when it comes to faith, will argue that philosophy, you know, doesn't really tie into that. And, you know, we were talking earlier, I did a semester at SES, and, you know, I took 2 philosophy classes, and I was kind of surprised to see, you know, references to Aristotle.
Yes.
And things like that. So can you just briefly explain to the people that are watching, you know, all 2 of my followers, if you could just explain to them, why is philosophy important?
Yeah, so it's not so much that philosophy right out the chute is important. What I think a better way to think about it is there are issues that are essential for us in our faith. Like, for example, we think Christianity is true.
Mm-hmm.
And we say we think the Bible is true. And I also think that most normal people, if you said, well, I think Christianity is true, they would know what you meant by that statement. But because of the influence of bad philosophies, now what it even means to be true is being called into question. So that now we could say, well, I think it's true that God exists. You'll hear somebody go, well, that's true for you, but not for me. And so in those situations then, where you are called upon to say, well, no, what I mean by true is, now we're doing philosophy.
Right.
That's a philosophical question. So you could think of any number of dimensions, even using the word faith. What is faith as opposed to reason? This is something that the church grappled with in the Middle Ages. Both Islam and Christianity had a tremendous sort of internal self-examination about, well, what is it to have faith? Is faith something we believe in spite of reason, or is it something that complements reason? How do these things work? Well, whatever decision we come to about that relationship, that's a philosophical question.
Right.
To say it's a philosophical question means that there are certain tools and methods that the philosopher uses to address these questions. And then I would go and say, further and say, and there's actually information that philosophy can bring to the table that helps us make the decision about, well, what is truth or what is faith? How does faith and reason relate? What is it to be a human being? What is the difference between a human and a non-human? Now, again, I think in a lot of situations, these questions, it's almost obvious to normal people. Of course, I know the difference between a human and a horse or whatever. But because of, again, the proliferation of bad philosophical influences over the centuries, now a lot of things that we think we could have taken for granted when we try to share the gospel, we're not so certain we can take for granted. I'll give you one other example. I had a couple of Christian high school teachers tell me in my office at the seminary that though they prepared their high school students for all kinds of apologetic issues, evolution, existence of God, reliability of the Bible, their students were being stumbled in their Christian faith when they went to university in the English department. And I thought, what in the world could happen in an English department? Well, what they were being taught is that it's not possible to read a text of a book and get the objective meaning out of that text that the author put into the text. So what they were saying instead was, when you read a text, you always alter the meaning because you always bring your own life experience and your worldview and all that. So you construct this new truth out of your life mixed with the text meaning. Well, then the students put 2 and 2 together and realize, well, then that means I can't get objective meaning from my Bible.
Right.
God must not be able to communicate objective truth to me. Well, how do you answer that? Well, that's a philosophical dispute on postmodernism and the nature of meaning and the connection between meaning and meaners and texts and writers and things like that. So these involve philosophical issues, the tools and methods and data points that philosophy offers to triage what otherwise normal people wouldn't have any problem, I think, understanding.
Right. Okay. Right. Now, so there is, within Christianity, there are different, schools of thought on the philosophical approaches to apologetics. Can you talk about those a little, like presuppositionalism?
Yes. So probably the two biggest camps, if you will, within evangelical is goes by different names. I call it the classical approach. Some people call it maybe evidentialism. There's some subtle distinctions there that are not really relevant on the one hand. And then as opposed to that would be the presuppositional. It goes by several different names, covenant apologetics. And so the differences have to do with the methods according to which we need to defend the faith. So typically the presuppositionalist is going to deny the idea that there's some kind of neutral common ground that we have with unbelievers from which we could launch an argument and conclude the God of the Bible. Because they're going to say any God that is the result of a human argument couldn't possibly be the infinite grounding God of all creation that the Bible shows us the real God to be. So they take great exception to the classical model, which would say, no, having all been created in the image of God, though the fall has effaced our reason and our will and things, it hasn't erased it. So it's still possible to take people from where they are, of what they see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, and construct a cogent argument to demonstrate the God of classical Christianity with all the superlative attributes, omniscient, omnipotent. Now, what that looks like would take some time to unpack, but I'm an ardent fan of this classical approach. And I realize there's not a presuppositionalist here to kind of give a better spin on his view, so I don't want to be unfair, but I run into a lot of people that want to say, well, I kind of take a balanced approach. But if they really understand the difference between the two approaches, you can't balance mutually exclusive.
Right.
But there is common between us because we're all humans, and we all, classical as well as presuppositionalists, regard the Bible as God's inerrant word. One theological thing that's relevant to it is typically presuppositionalists are Reformed Calvinists, and so their theology, and they would insist upon this, one's apologetic method must arise out of a sound theology.
That makes sense.
That does make sense. And so not all Calvinists, however, have been classical, including people like R.C. Sproul is a great example of a thoroughly Reformed in his theology, but was solidly classical in his approach. And Sproul and others would argue this is really more the tradition of the Reformation, going back through the Princeton giants, Hodge and Warfield and these guys, and even back further, Puritan, the Puritans, Charnock. You can go all the way back, and I would argue even to Calvin himself. That it's more in line with this classical approach than it is the presuppositionalism.
That's so interesting. I just got done reading his book, Chosen by God.
Okay.
And that was a very, very interesting book.
Yes. No, he's been a hero of mine for a long time.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's a great man.
Absolutely.
So if a young person who maybe is going off to college, if they wanted to learn more about this, what books would you recommend that they
You
read?
mean this being the presuppositional
the
thing?
difference between the classical, the presuppositional, and things that'll flesh that out.
Yeah, so two things to bear in mind. In both camps, there are sort of variations.
Okay.
So I have my prejudice as to who I think the best. So as far as the presuppositionalists, I tend to be a purist in the tradition of Van Til and Bahnsen.
Okay.
As far purist meaning that I think that's the best arguments for it. So I don't think anybody's been able to top Greg Bahnsen in terms of his interpretation of Van Til. So he's got a Van Til reader where he quotes from Van Til and then commentary on it. But as I say, there are presuppositionalists that would deviate slightly. John Frame is a little bit different. Scott Oliphant has qualified it a little bit. And others have Francis Schaeffer, Nancy Piercy. They're all sort of variations of presupposition. Same thing on our camp. So R.C. Sproul, we mentioned him already, wrote a book called Classical Apologetics and a Critique of Presuppositional.
Okay.
So that would be one where he's going to defend the classical model and critique the presuppositionalists. So Bahnsen would be a great source for solid, I think, presuppositional, and then people like Sproul would be a good source for the classical model. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my mentor, Norman Geisler, who just recently went to be with the Lord, and he mentored me both in apologetics and philosophy. So anything like his philosophy of religion that he's written would be a great start as well on some of this more classical approach.
That was the class.
Is that right?
Yes,
Okay,
philosophy
all right.
of religion.
Yeah, philosophy of religion.
That made my
Well,
head
you-
want to
You
explode.
decided to start off easy then, right?
Right?
Yeah,
Both
exactly.
feet, you know? Oh, that's funny. Well, Richard, it is always a pleasure. You just bring so much joy to
You're too kind to
I mean,
say
really,
that.
and by the way, for those that know me, I mean, I have a dog named Chewie after Chewbacca. I am a Star Wars, fan, and Richard does the greatest presentation about Star Wars
I love the
and
movies.
religion.
Oh, absolutely.
Can people find that online?
Yeah, well, the presentation itself is not online because it's fraught with all these clips from the movies which are copyrighted. So
Right.
whenever I do give it publicly, I ask them not to record it for copyright. But a book version of that, Religion of the Force, that I co-wrote with Norm Geisler.
Okay.
And it's basically the presentation in written form, minus The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, because the book came out in anticipation of The Force Awakens. So I had a few trailers to cull from, but not really what my PowerPoint presentation now goes on to do, all the way up at least through The Last Jedi.
All right. Well, if you love Star Wars and you love Jesus, you got to read that book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
You're
sir.
quite welcome.